Hi everybody, welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jane Hewitt and I'm the Capability Building Coordinator at Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand. Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand are part of the Info Exchange Group, a not-for-profit social enterprise that tackles the biggest social challenges through the smart and creative use of technology. And for those who haven't joined us before, Connecting Up and TechSoup facilitate an annual training calendar of workshops, boot camps, webinars and webcons to help the social sector upskill in all things digital. And you can check out our training and events menu on our website for more details. So welcome today to the webinar Risk Management, Who Does It Belong To? With Jenny Holiday and Graham Baxter from Nonprofit Training. And just before we begin, we'll start with a bit of housekeeping. All lines are muted, so if you have any technical issues, please type them into the questions box on your GoToWebinar panel and I should be able to assist you. If you have any questions during the session, please also type them into the questions box and the presenters will answer them. We'll have the Q&A session coming up 10 minutes at the end of the webinar. And please note that your comments and questions won't appear to the entire group. If you're on a Wi-Fi connection, please could you close any programs that you're not using so to get the best quality for audio and video. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and I'll be uploading the recording and slides onto our website and sending them out towards the end of today. Just before I start, I'd like to remind you that we will send out a short survey right at the end of this webinar. So we'd really appreciate you if you just take a couple of moments to fill that in so we can improve future webinars. So that's all from me. I will now pass you over to Jenny and Graham to get started.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much for that introduction, Jane. My name's Jenny Holiday and my co-presenter is Graham Baxter, as mentioned. Before we kick off, we'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands that we're meeting across today and pay our respects to their elders past, present and their emerging leaders. So what a topic to be talking about at the moment. Graham and I have shared lots of experiences over the last year, in fact, that have really changed risk profiles for organisations, and I'm guessing that's why you're here. So Nonprofit Training has been working with organisations across Australia for many years now, and it's in areas such as risk management and governance, understanding your finances and teamwork and a range of other activities, because we know that this is not necessarily what you come to your organisation to do. And sometimes it might be that your risk matrix has been turned upside down and that's why you're here. Or it might be that it's just been a really difficult 6 or 12 months for you and you're looking to put something in place. So welcome to the session. And Graham is joining me. Graham has an extensive background in risk management, and that stems from a state-based agency where he's worked in and amongst emergency management. And of course, with that comes really good risk management and planning. And as a director of Nonprofit Training, I've been facilitating and working with charities and not-for-profits across the country for a long time now, around about 25 years. And so the issues that we see across organisations are quite often fairly common. And so it'd be good to share some of our experience with you today. So just in terms of what we're going to cover today, we're looking to understand the types of risks that your organisation is exposed to. And you already may have a very complex risk register and have identified a number of risks across your organisation, or as I mentioned, you might just be starting out. So we're going to look at the risk management process, and whether you are well attuned to risk management or you are just starting out, it's always great to consistently reflect on the risk management process so that you feel like you're up to date with some of the things that may or may not happen, and that you're able to adjust and amend the activities that you're undertaking in your organisation. So we're looking at also who's taking responsibility for risk management across the whole of the organisation. And sometimes organisations believe that it belongs to the board as part of their governance role. But of course, in your organisations, whether they're big or small, they might have volunteers who are really good at identifying some of the risks that the organisation is exposed to, as well as the staff, and also there's some board risks that are specific to the board. So we're looking to pull together for you a workable risk management plan because sometimes that is a blocker for people to establish their risk management register and their framework because it seems a little bit overwhelming, and where do we start? But we're looking to break that down to make it a bit easier for you. And we're also looking to have a look at some online tools. And if you're at the start and you're looking to get a great deal of input, looking at some of the tools that you can use to do that. So I'm going to now hand you over to Graham to start to look at the risk and the management process.
Thanks, Jen, and thank you everybody for joining in the session today. We really appreciate you taking your time to join us. The thing that that's probably the foremost to get ourselves started with is actually, so what is risk? And I think if anybody's noticed anything over the last 12 months, the risk and the amount of change that's happened over this period of time has been, well, hasn't been like we probably would have experienced in our lives before. So we're pretty much front of mind and we're highly attuned to risk. But I think it's really important for everyone to understand that risk is normal. It is always there. And even if we didn't have COVID, risk is an important element for us to be able to function with our groups. Now, whether you're someone who functions at a board level, as a committee of management, whether you're executive, no matter where you are within the organisation, or probably for organisations that you're all a part of, it's really important to know that risk is actually a normal thing. Incidents, events happen. They might happen from within your organisation, but they might happen externally. And as Jen mentioned before, everybody has a role to play in being able to identify risk, but also to be able to mitigate risk. Because we can't be leaving it up to one group of people, because without that, we really have narrowed about how we can go about do things. So essentially, risk, as you can see there on screen, is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So that is, how do we actually be able to identify what's going on? How do we know what sort of risk is in place? And by planning for an event, even though we might know everything that will happen, and some people might say that COVID was a potential risk that many societies would have known about or have experienced before, we can plan and prepare so that when we do, it actually reduces the panic. Because often when we have a risk emerge very quickly, it's very easy to panic. It actually provides certainty for people around you in your organisation, because the comfort of actually knowing that there is a plan, you have actually thought about what's involved with the process, and that you then have a path to actually move through with confidence. So it's about risk being normal, change is normal, and it really is a matter about how you choose to actually manage it. And that's part of what the process is today. So Jen, I think we might head off into the next section and we'll actually look at what the process is. So risk management, like many things, has a step process that you can work through. And it's important that we do work through the process. The reason being is that when an unexpected event does occur, it's normal and it's natural, and it's a tendency for people to actually identify the risk and then want to go to step 5, which is to treat it straight away. And if you treat it straight away, generally you're going to probably finish up with a less elegant solution to the problem. The chances are that you're going to finish up having poor communications and poor implementation and poor uptake for what that treatment's going to be. So essentially, the first part is to identify what the risk is, and that doesn't mean as it's happened. Ideally, you've identified the risk very early on, and you've been able to plan and have that ready for when that risk does land, that you're actually ready to go for it. The second stage is, well, what's the impact? So it could be you could be identifying a risk that really is a very low impact. And so in terms of its urgency and priority for treatment is actually lower down the scale. So it's identify what's the impact. You then assess what is actually in place and what may not be in place to actually have at the moment, and then you can rate it. And in a moment, we're going to go through a risk matrix and actually go through that rating process. Once you've rated it, you've actually really become clear about what it is, how big the issue is, how much you need to treat it, and then you commence the treatment process. Now, often people think about a process like this, as soon as you've done one, you move directly on to the next one once you've completed it. It's really important that risk management is a continual loop of review, 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 review the whole process, because even though a risk may have appeared or the issue has appeared, situations can be changing rapidly. So it's really important that you continue to monitor all through the process, not just at the end of the treatment, but you're actually monitoring the situations that's going on. And so that becomes a simple 6-step process. But as I mentioned before, it's really important that you actually look at identifying your risks early, because the most important thing you can do is do the thinking that actually enables your body, your organisation or your group or your community group to be ready for when that risk actually lands, because it gives people confidence that there is a process that they're to follow and confidence in the leadership to actually lead them safely through it. So in terms of things for you to be mindful of when identifying risks, whether you're a board member, whether you're a committee of management member, a member of a leadership team, or another member of an organisation, you need to make sure that when it comes to identifying risks, there are 6 elements to be mindful of. And so the first one there you can see in the pie chart there, right in the bottom is it legal? So what you're involved in, the activities that you're doing, are they actually legal? Can you be doing that particular activity? For instance, if you're working in a council premises, are you actually legally allowed to run that activity within that process, in that organisation? It's also about making sure that you're actually tracking things such as potential fraud and corruption. So even though it might not be that, it might be that you actually need to be, if you have staff, are you actually managing and monitoring your staff leave, for example, so that making sure that all of their leave is accumulated and tabulated, and you're not building this massive risk to the organisation through unidentified costs. And it's not just small organisations that actually run the risk of being running into legal issues. For at the moment, there are many public situations where companies that are actually running into legal challenges. So it's important that you actually ask the question, is it legal? The second one is heading up to, is it safe? So is what you're doing safe for you, your organisation, your people, but also the people that you're serving? Now, it may be customers, it may be clients, or it may be members of your organisation. So is it safe? And again, if it's not safe, then you need to think about, should you be doing that activity in the first place? And then working through the risk assessment process. Is it sustainable? So is what you're doing sustainable? And that's one of the things that's cropped up very often during the COVID process, is that all of a sudden a brand new risk has arrived, and then people have realised that their business model or the way they've been operating may not be sustainable. And so by identifying the risks within that sustainability, then can begin to put those into a plan to mitigate those. And then to the next step we finish up is, if we can just do the next one there, Jen. Thank you very much. It's one thing to actually, for you and the key people, to making sure, is it legal, is it safe, is it sustainable, but are you communicating? Are you engaging with customers, clients, community members? Are you making sure that you're actually engaging with them, and are you communicating with them in a way that works for them, not just works for you, but actually works for them? And so one of the things you can have in place, which is the next one, Jen, which is making sure that you've got good governance in place. And so sitting around that communication engagement is making sure you've got good structures, systems and processes, so that you've actually got good coverage across the organisation. And governance has been a bit challenging for many people, particularly as been heading to the online option. That's made it a bit tricky for some organisations, whether they're having online AGMs and the challenges of actually not being able to meet face to face. And the thing that sits around all of that is culture. And what's your organisation's culture? And culture in the short form it's the way we do things around here. Well, it's all around the behaviours that you, as a leader, as a team member, as a group member, it's how do you behave around your people, and what are the symbols and what are the systems and processes you've got in place to make sure that everybody is safe. It's a safe that is culturally competent. It's a culture that is safe and it's engaging and it's embracing those people who your organisation there is in fact working for. So when it comes to beginning to identify risks, there is a way that we can actually rate the importance of risks. And what we're going to do now is actually go through a risk matrix and step you through that process. So I'll give you a couple of the, oh, thanks, Jen, I missed that one. So risk categories, so they can be at the organisational level, and where you can see that might be service delivery, project failure or stakeholder management. It can be at that particular level, but it's also important that you think about the wider perspectives that go with that, because it's important that that you have legal obligations that you need to comply, and that might be with some submissions of annual returns. It's about keeping a member risk register, but also making sure that as an organisation, you're abiding by conflict of interest declarations. That is, you're not making a direct benefit out of the organisation that you're with. And as we mentioned before, in terms of compliance, there are OH&S issues. And we think about the new manslaughter legislation that's come through. We all have a really important role to play there. The thing that risk is, and it becomes very easy for us to think about risk as being something bad and negative. Risk, and we'll see this as an example when we go through the risk matrix, risk is an opportunity to actually really look at your organisation and think about the very reason why your organisation's risk exists. Why you're there, what do you do, and how you might go about it is likely and quite possibly going to change. And if no other time, apart from the last 12 months with COVID, have we actually had that opportunity to actually reflect and look at why we're doing it, what are we doing it, what do we do, and how do we go about doing it? Because many, many organisations have actually been able to come up with really innovative ways to actually achieve really great outcomes that they were originally designed for, but they're now able to do it in a different way. And that can be done through the way you actually deliver your service. It could be looking at where you're getting those funding opportunities, and can also be rethinking about the structure of your organisation. And we'll touch on one of those when we come to the risk rating matrix. Thanks, Jen.
So thanks, Graham. So it's everyone, of course, will have different categories based on the type of organisation they are. So these are just examples of categories that we've put together for this purpose. And you might reflect on how you clump. I don't know, Graham, whether that's an official risk management term, but how you categorise your risks will be dependent on your organisation and the way you see the different parts of the organisation fitting into those categories. But it's good to then think about, well, do we have an owner of those risk categories? Is there a natural way that ownership falls? And that sometimes helps you to work out who is keeping control and looking after those risk categories. So as Graham mentioned, we're going to go into a risk register, but what I want to do now is to get you to respond to a poll and see who has a risk register in place and whether you use it regularly. Let's just have a look at whether we have a lot of that happening at the moment already. We've had nearly most of you have voted, and we can see that some people have got something in place and that you're using it regularly. Others may not have something in place or just may not be using it regularly. And as I mentioned right at the start, one of the blockers to be able to, I hope everyone's seen that poll. Okay,
Yep.
so one of the blockers to making sure that you're actively using the risk register is that it can be a little bit overwhelming. So what we're going to go to now is just having a look at the risk rating, as Graham mentioned before. So Graham, you can take us through that.
Thanks, Jen. Now, for those people of the 56%, I think it was, that have actually got a risk register system going, the chances are that you've seen this particular matrix or something similar before. For those of you that haven't seen one before, what we're going to do is actually just step through one. And one of the things that what I sort of emphasise, it's one thing to actually have a risk register, but it's really important to look at, to consider how active you are with it. How regularly do you actually monitor and review and check in with it, because circumstances change and can change very, very quickly, again, as we've noticed over the last 12 months. So what I wanted to do is just to go through how you might use a risk matrix such as this one there, this one here we can see. Basically, down the left-hand column there, you can actually see what the likelihood of a particular risk actually happening, being ranging from a score of 5, which is almost certain, to rare being 1. And then across the top, what are the consequences or the impacts of that risk actually happening? And so we can begin to score our risks and then begin to prioritise our risks, because it can be very, very overwhelming, as Jen mentioned before. If you've suddenly put a list of 30 risks together, it becomes an issue of, well, so where do I start? Where do we go with this here? It's all too hard. Someone else can deal with it when they become on the next committee of management. We'll just pretend it's not happening for a while. So the whole idea is to be able to look at what are the most urgent ones and what are the ones most important for you to deal with. So to give you an example, I've got a couple of ones that we can then touch on there. So if we were looking at, and we could just bring that matrix back up again then, please, Jen. I've lost it here in front of me here. It would use an example is that for many groups, particularly committees of management, some of those groups have actually struggled with their sporting clubs. And that is the sporting clubs haven't been operating, and over a period of time, some sporting clubs have probably got into a system or an area where they've had no succession plans for their committees of management. And over time, their committees of management gotten a bit older, COVID's taken place, and all of a sudden, a whole lot of people are beginning to say, well, I think I'm done. And all of a sudden, they haven't got enough members for their committee of management. So we can look at that that is likely to happen for many, many organisations. And Jen and I have sort of been working with some where that is very evident. So if you're looking at that, it's being likely, and the potential consequence for an organisation is that can actually be bad. And so we would finish up in the matrix there where 3 bad meets 4, that finishes up with a score of 12. And it finishes up in the orange sector, the white sector being low, the medium sector being yellow, and the orange sector is high, with the dark red being extreme. So as an organised sporting group with potentially no committee of management, they're going to finish up probably in a high risk area. They can be mitigating that risk by beginning to look at how they advertise for new members, chunk down the roles that are actually involved, and they can actually quite easily shift that from being a high risk to a medium risk, because it's possible that they will struggle to get a committee of management. However, it may be that the likelihood is probably more down to a not good result, but unlikely to happen. So you can vary them around a bit by actually beginning to mitigate those risks. For some people, it begins to think of, well, so where is something catastrophic going to be, and what's the scale of something that is almost certain? And that's going to vary from organisation to organisation. An example that I can give you is that as being a director of national parks over last summer, managing the area of Gippsland. One of the things that we had is we had a whole lot of people that were out camping and holidaying and hiking, and we were actually getting reports, weather reports and fire weather reports, telling us that we were going to have quite an extensive fire runs in several days' time. So all of a sudden, our risk rating went from being went direct to catastrophic, and the likelihood was almost likely to being certain. Inherent in that was that could have led to multiple deaths, multiple people being stranded, and then multiple people in locations where they needed to be looked after by people in communities who are being fire affected. So for us, what we did is we sat down, looked at our plan, went through our step process, and got to the point where the treatment was, we will be evacuating everybody out of East Gippsland. We were able to achieve that in 24 hours. We had everybody out of the area, they were safe, and we were able to mitigate that risk. Several days later on, that's when some of the large fires blew up. So it's about being able to step through the process, being able to score it, and we will then be able to shift something from that was catastrophic all the way down to something that was a score of 25 down to a score of 6. It was going to be unlikely. Outcomes would have been bad, but the outcomes were going to be unlikely. So that's really one way of actually just stepping through the risk rating process. And it doesn't have to always be done face-to-face, Jen. How might we go about doing it?
Yeah, so Graham, what we're bringing up now is the risk matrix that Graham just talked through, and hopefully everyone can see that. And we're going to think about, well, what are our lives now? What if we have an organisation that works across multiple locations? What if we have a board who is spread across the country? Or the fact is we just can't get all of the team that we want to have as part of this risk identification and the assessment process in the one room together. So what we're going to do is to use the Miro tool. Now, this is just one of the many online platforms that is fantastic for sharing information and ideas. And in this case, we're going to look to quickly pull together our assessment of a couple of risks that we've identified for our organisation. So this is a great tool. I've used it for strategic planning with teams who really need to pull their strategic plan together very quickly and put it on a Kanban board, which is what it's called. So different parts of the board identified the different areas that they might have their input into strategic planning. So that came together really quickly. I've also used it for a national organisation who didn't have a database. And so what we did was to start to put together a stakeholder map all together in the one online. We couldn't get together, so we did it online, and very quickly we had over 100 organisations identified on that map just through 4 of us working together. So it's a really great tool. But what Graham and I are going to do now is just talk about the 2 risks that we've identified here. The loss of external funding for our social enterprise project, which is part of our organisation, and a key person risk. So that is about identifying people within your organisation that if they were to leave, what would be the impact on the organisation? And that might be someone like a chair of the board. It might be someone who has been there for a long period of time, even a volunteer, who has a lot of stuff hanging around in their head, and we haven't got around to getting that down. So it might be the loss of knowledge. It might just be the person who helps the group hang together really well as a team. And so it's the cultural manager, I guess, of the organisation. So Graham, we've got those two issues there. So I'm going to get you to start. I think you're yellow. What we're doing over here is just attaching a sticky note. I'm going to be the green sticky note, and I'm going to move my sticky note across the screen and say that the loss of external funding for the social enterprise is about here. So I'll put number 1 risk in. And Graham, you're probably starting to drag your sticky notes in as well. And the key is that not that we've got the same risk rating, it's about why there is a difference. And so we'll talk you through that in just a minute. And I'm going to put the key person risk down here. So,
well, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one, Jen. I think this is something we probably need to talk about in terms of, yep. So it's interesting. We're very different.
Yeah, and this is something that comes up frequently, whether it's because Graham and I have a different appetite for risk. An appetite for risk might mean that Graham is, oh, she'll be right, whereas I might want to pay attention to the fine details and be concerned about a particular risk. Or it might be that I am not aware of the sorts of things that the organisation has in place in order to mitigate that risk. So Graham, what I can see there is that you've put the first one, you've put I think risk number one up in that bad area.
Yeah. So do you want to kind of have a quick chat to explain it, Jen? Because I'm just really concerned that we've the funding for that particular project is intrinsic for us to be able to continue from how I understand it. So I think it's almost certain that we're going to finish up with pretty much a bad outcome, particularly with the services we were trying to deliver beforehand.
Yeah, so the reason that I've rated that risk, Graham, a bit lower than what you have is that, yes, I believe it's pretty likely that we are going to lose the funding because the government now has other priorities, and it was touch and go as to whether we were going to get that project refunded. So it's not altogether a surprise, and I think it is likely given the change in priorities. But what the reason I've only rated it bad there is that what I've done is an assessment on the social enterprise, and we started it up, as you know, this time last year. But it's actually tracking really well against the milestones. In fact, we're a bit ahead of that point where the social enterprise becomes profitable. And so while we'll enter into the period of lack of funding, where it's still not profitable, I think that we're going to reach that profitability milestone 3 months earlier than what we expected. So the key here, I think, is to go to the board and identify to them what level of funding they will need to commit to in order to keep this social enterprise going. And so I've done a bit of a back of the envelope calculation, and I think that probably it will be to the tune of about $30,000. So that's certainly something that the board need to decide on. So how does that fall in terms of your thinking?
Oh, well, because you're across that extra bit of information, which is a code for everybody listening in, is making sure that you're actually having a broad sweep of getting a broad sweep of information about your organisation. I feel much more comfortable about aligning mine with yours in there. So hence I'm tracking mine next to yours. I think it's a much better outcome and a much better take on the situation. Thanks, Jen.
Yeah, but of course, some of those risks about coming to profitability, we need to be monitoring those because if they don't come to fruition, all of a sudden, rather than a $30,000 use of the reserve of the organisation may blow out. So that I think that we'll need to keep monitoring that pretty closely, Graham. So how about the second risk, the key person risk? And we know that we've identified Deb as a person who has a lot of knowledge, has been around the organisation, and she's been talking a little bit about moving on lately. So tell me about why you've rated that up in the quite high category.
I put it in the quite high because while I'm not sure what's being put in place in terms of succession planning and what her intent actually is. So I'm a bit anxious that she might leave quickly and then depart the organisation, and then we lose contact with her. So I've gone very conservative here without being able to find out a bit more information about. So what do we know about her succession planning? What sort of handover might she be thinking about, and what things we can put in place? So this one's a new issue for me, so that's why I've gone very conservative with it, Jen. So if you've got further info, that'd be terrific.
Yeah, so look, I think it is possible that that she'll leave, but the key thing in succession planning is always making sure that you're doing everything that you can in advance so that you don't lose valuable staff. And it may just be that that staff member's time is up with the organisation, and that's certainly their decision. But we're wanting to, I guess, to dig into some of the reasons that we're hearing a bit of murmurs. But what I do know is that we have quite, the consequence is not going to be quite as bad as it maybe would have been a year ago with Deb, because we've started to track some of those processes and get them down on paper. And what I've noticed is that she started to mentor the new person that's sitting in her team. So we have some of that transition of knowledge already happening. So Deb's doing a really good job of that. But what we do just need to check is, well, what's missing? How likely and how soon it is that Deb might move on, if we can do anything to retain her. But of course, just making sure that we do have that information in place. So if she has decided to move on, what is the lead time? So they're all the mitigating factors that we want to take into account when we're working out what we're going to do from here, because it's okay to rate these risks, but what happens from here is one of the key things. So I don't know how everyone went in following Graham and my assessment there, and whether you think that this Miro might be a good online collaboration tool for you. What it does do is to expedite, if you have already identified a list of risks and numbered them all, this can really expedite the process to pulling it all together to form that framework of this is where we think it sits. And from there, it's about then working out, well, what we're going to do about it, of course. And sometimes that is the big piece of work rather than just rating the risk. So Graham, I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and maybe
Thanks,
we
Jen.
can start to look at or think about how we move on from just the rating.
Yeah, so it's one thing to actually have the rating, and then it's really important that you actually begin to think about, well, how are you actually going to mitigate those risks, and how are you going to monitor and manage those over time? And so that's where, and also how you report that, because it depends on where you are within the organisation. Are you being reported to, or are you the one who is actually, or your part of the organisation is setting up the reporting, so to brief the wider organisation about what's going on. So it's important that you begin to think about, well, what's the risk cat, and we've actually got one set up there for you, and you'll get a copy of all of this as well. But basically, it's actually working through what's the risk category, and what actually is the risk, what are existing controls, and working all the way through to actually, well, what is actually the risk rating at the moment, and then all going well, where you think if you actually implement these controls, where your risk will finish up. And as you can see through there on the screen, I'm not sure how well you can see it there, but essentially it's important that you're actually tracking it. So where there's the column there that talks about the trend, it's important that you're actually monitoring over time because it's incredibly important that you are keeping check of that. The other thing is that if we look at the column there which reads the risk owner, it's about who is accountable for this. It's one thing to have a risk register and everyone goes, yes, we've got a risk of X in the organisation, but unless someone is accountable, it is very easy for everyone to assume that someone else is going to be taking care of it. So that becomes crucial to being able to manage risk effectively. Now, the risk register is something that every organisation should be monitoring very, very regularly. I'm on I'm the chair of a audit and risk committee for a small rural hospital, and we're checking our risk register every 3 months. Now, during COVID, as you would fully understand, that changes, and that's been doing that far more regularly. But your organisation, depending on the circumstances that are actually happening, is something you should be checking in and reviewing very, very regularly. And as I was saying before, making sure that you are really dealing with the high priority, those extreme and highs, they become the most urgent for you to deal with. Is there anything I wanted to touch on there, Jen?
That's one of the things that that can become overwhelming. I know that Graham and I have done a piece of work with an organisation, and we came up, we did the work across the organisation, so the volunteers, the staff and the board all had input, and we came up with 72 risks on our risk register. And when that was first presented to the board, the chair certainly said to me, well, who's the negative Nelly that came up with this list? And it wasn't, that was a time then it really alerted me to making sure that it didn't become overwhelming. And I said, well, there is 72 risks, but for an organisation that worked in domestic violence, it was a very high risk organisation in the activities. And the only couple of risks, there was only 2 risks that were in that extreme category. So they were actually managing risk really well, but it was frightening for the board to see that great big list of risks that were identified that could or may happen, but if they did happen, they've got something in place to manage really well. So one of the things that I like to do is to be able to use something like what is on the screen at the moment to really narrow down the amount of information that's presented to the board based on what they want to see. They don't want to see a great big risk register that spreads over 5 pages, that's in 3 fonts. They definitely want to see something that focuses their attention on the things that are key now. And so part of your framework is working out, well, how do you report, but also how do you keep the board updated on risks that are starting to trend towards moving into an area that the board's unsatisfied with. So all of that takes a really good conversation. And so it's very important that you have those discussions and that you do it in a way that is manageable so that it is not overwhelming either for the board or staff or any volunteers that you're working with at the time. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen because I've lost my little cursor for some reason, my functionality. So just in the next screen, Gray, we have the risk maturity.
Yep. So risk maturity is like risk changes over time. So it's basically it's often referred to as the tolerance or the appetite that an organisation may or may not have for the level of risk that is present at any given time. And whether you're on a board, a committee of management, or you're reporting through to one, or reporting to as a team through to that, it's important to get an idea about what the organisation's risk tolerance is at that particular time. And I'll be pretty sure that any organisation has had a massive shift in the last 12 months for their tolerance to risk, as COVID has brought about unprecedented changes to organisations. And so that basically one of the things that you may have noticed that again, if you're on the board or committee of management, that all of a sudden during the year you've been delving far more into the operational detail of the organisation because you're wanting more information to know exactly what's happening, where and when. Probably asking questions that otherwise you wouldn't normally be asking, that you would either leave to other aspects of the organisation management to deal with, that is their particular part to do it. So risk maturity changes over a period of time. Now, in the more traditional senses of risk management, the traditional way is that it becomes very much about looking at protecting assets, physical, financial, looking at the nuts and bolts of the organisation. Management is looking at particular aspects, managing in solos, and very inconsistent approaches. Whereas now, organisations are more looking at a more advanced style where they're looking at being organisations to support the committee of management, support the board. They are all in it together. And that's where a very mature organisation, as Jen was alluding to at the very beginning of the session, is that everybody understands that they all have a role to play in managing risk. It is not just up to one person who's actually got the accountability. Everybody needs to make sure that their organisation is managing risk effectively, because it takes a whole team to be able to do that. And so in that situation, a mature approach is when you're looking at both operational and strategic needs of the organisation, not operating in silos. It does also mean you need to be monitoring the profile, and it's also that it's important that remembering that risk maturity can be changing over time, so you do need to be sensitive to that. Thanks, Jen.
Great. Jane, that nearly brings us to the end of the session. But I might ask you to take back control because I've lost my ability to control the screen. So we're just seeing the landing page. So what I did want to ask is that second poll, though, if you're able to open it up, Jane. And the second poll is talking about where you think your organisation is in relation to maturity of your risk framework. So we'll just invite you to respond to that.
Yep, we're just collecting, almost there.
Thanks, Jane.
70% have voted.
Great. So we're seeing that 67% are thinking that they're in the basic area, Graham, and 33% are saying that they are in the mature. There's no one in the advanced area. So it'd be really interesting to see what sort of questions people have in order to get a feel for how they might be able to shift that. So it's over to you, Jane.
We have one question just saying, is there a particular time of the year when a risk matrix should be undertaken?
Jen, do you want to go? Or...
Okay, so no, certainly there isn't a time of the year. I would certainly diarise it and plan for it, because to get to that mature level that Graham was talking about, it is involving a range of people that are going to interact with it. So it's if there is a time when you're leading up to a big event, if you have an organisation that runs a big event, and certainly you want your risk planning to have been done very early on and way before the event, because not only do events themselves raise risks, and so you would assess that particular project, but of course events take a lot of time and energy out of the whole of the organisation. And so events can be risky in that other projects get put aside because of the urgency of the event. So working out how you're going to manage that. So there's not a specific time that I believe that it needs to be done, but it needs to be diarised in the annual calendar and some time set aside for that regular review, as Graham was talking about earlier. Graham, in the organisations that you've worked with, has there been particular time frames that you've said this is the best time?
No, we haven't worked on the best time. We haven't worked that way. Obviously, well, if there's a big event coming up, then obviously there are specifics around the risk management profile we'll be checking. But I think probably one thing that might be happening for some people is that so when do we get started and how do we get started if they actually haven't got something in place at the moment. And I think the thing that's really important there is that you, whether again the committee of management or the board or the operating group, that you actually do that together and you get buy-in from everyone. So it's not just, you might be a driver, but you need to get buy-in from everyone. And it's one of the things to be mindful of is Jen was alluding to the 72 risks before, is that just be mindful that people may be overwhelmed when you start talking about it. So to actually alleviate some of the concerns is that good risk management actually makes it easier for the management team to do their work. It makes it easier on your service delivery or what outcomes you're trying to achieve for your organisation, and it means a much smoother way of operating. So in terms of the best time of the year, no, but again, that will depend on your organisation. So for my experience, doing a lot of work in fire, obviously our risk management will have been done well and truly by this time of the year. So that might depend on your organisation. But it's really important that if you've got the time and got the drive, start as soon as you can.
Yeah, right.
Thank you, Graham. We've got another question for, this is from Alison. For a board that hasn't taken an active role in risk management, can you suggest some questions, topic areas that can be asking of paid staff at regular board meetings?
Jane, I always like to start off the conversation with making sure that there's an agenda item that talks about risk, where we just identify what are your 3 top risks and how would you rate them. So go through the process of, that Graham and I did on that Miro board of rating the risks and talking through why board members rate their risks in that way, because that reveals a lot of things about the different personalities that sit around the room and their risk appetite. So there's some people who are constantly thinking about loss of funding as an example. But what we've got might have in place is really great relationships with funders. We've got some form of self-generated or discretionary revenue that we can ramp up if we look to put the time and effort into it. So quite often the board are not aware of some of the mitigating factors, and so almost they avoid talking about risk. So I would just start off with getting them to go through that process of mapping it out, because it can be a bit frightening. I know that I did a piece of work with an international group, and they had their risk ratings, so many of them up in that extreme category, and it was they really didn't want to talk about it because they just didn't know where to start. So by just saying, what are your top 3 risks and how do we rate them, and going through that mechanism, it was a real, you could see everybody's shoulders relax. And so starting off in that way and attending to those things that they identify as risks and getting a feel for where they're placed and what, of course, what they will tolerate is a good idea. So how about you, Graham?
Yeah, I agree with those, Jen. And I think another way you might want to begin the conversation with the board is the chances are is that if you haven't got a strong risk management framework or focus in the organisation, the chances are there's a lot of issues that are coming up to board level that really may not need to be at board level and could have been mitigated much, much earlier if there was a much more mature way of looking at risk. And so it might be as a way of introducing the concept to the board is maybe going through the last 2 or 3 board meeting papers and beginning to say, well, this issue has come to us. Really, should that have actually got to that point? Should that have got to that stage? Could the issues have been mitigated if we'd actually been able to, as an organisation, to identify the risk and then put things in place to mitigate it? So a more planned approach so that the board is able to get confidence that risks are being managed and they're not being distracted by dealing with spot fires that really should have been dealt with at a much different level of the organisation.
Yeah, and hand in hand with Graham's response there is things such as a delegations policy. So the risk management framework really includes the policy framework as well, because when you have good quality policies in place, it makes it a lot easier for everyone to understand what their boundaries are and what does need to be escalated to the board. And the delegation of authority document, or some people call it the instrument of delegation or the delegations policy, is one of those documents that says, well, this is who deals with this. They've got the authority to do that, but anything beyond that is escalated to the board. So having that rigor around also helps to bring that clarity that Graham was talking about.
Actually, no, I'm not sure there's any more questions, but just to touch on that, another one with the relating to the idea about when is the best time to actually begin the process. Again, being on a hospital board, what we do is we actually have our risk review and our audits, because we audit quite a lot as well. We have those structured 3 years in advance. So we're running through cycles of auditing. So again, we can manage risk, whether it's fraud and corruption, whether it's in terms of our financials. They're structured a long way out. And again, it's quite a large organisation, but it's something you can have in place there. But you can systematise it, even though you may not be there in the organisation in time to come as well.
Yeah.
Great. I think that's it for all the questions. But if anybody's got any more, they just want to type in very quickly. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Graham and Jenny, for joining us today. And thank you, everybody who has joined the webinar. And like I said at the beginning, I will be sending out the recordings towards the end of today, along with details of Jenny and Graham's emails if people want to get in touch with them, and also any links to non-profit training that you want to include that we can pass along to the attendees. And for everybody who attended, please could you take them a couple of minutes to fill in that survey that will pop up when this webinar finishes.
And Jane, just to round that off, thank you for that. But also we'll be to go to our website, so Jen's going to have the links, and we'll be able to send you a crisis management flow chart as part of this, because certainly crisis management is part of good risk management, and having that crisis and decisions made in advance is a really important aspect of managing risks really well, so they can be de-escalated as quickly as possible, whether it's a crisis because of what we've been through with COVID-19 or the bushfires as Graham was talking about, or whether it is just that person who's left your organisation in a hurry and all of a sudden things are falling apart. So having that crisis management plan and steps to take is a really good asset, and I guess linked to your risk management plan.
Perfect. Thank you both so much, and we'll see everybody again very soon. Thanks, both.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jane.